Hey guys, let's get more news about Steelers, but first, don't forget to subscribe and leave your like. Broncos' $96 million NFL All-Pro struggles in Week 2. Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver George Pickens cared little for the hype around his matchup with Denver Broncos cornerback Patrick Surtain II headed into Week 2. Pickens didn't care about Surtain's 4-year, $96 million contract or that he was an NFL All-Pro or two-time Pro Bowler. Just be myself, to be honest. I went up against Pat Surtain in college, Pickens told Yardbarker's Aaron Becker in a post on X, so a lot of this stuff isn't new for me. He's just a good player. I'm a good player. There's a lot of good players around the league. Calling Surtain good after how he played in a 13-6 loss to the Steelers on September 15 might be a bit of a stretch. He was called for 3 penalties for 50 yards, 2 against Pickens. Pickens had a touchdown catch and a 50-yard reception on Surtain wiped out by offensive penalties. 3 penalty flags for 50-plus yards, against a Steelers wide receivers group no one will confuse with Hines Ward, Emmanuel Sanders and Antonio Brown? Yes, Surtain is Denver's best player. And on a roster devoid of star power, with great expectations comes great responsibility, wrote the Denver Gazette's Paul Klee. The Broncos don't have enough oomph elsewhere to make up for Surtain's shaky games. His pass interference penalty on George Pickens was an obvious call and extended a Steelers drive. Despite being regarded as one of the NFL's top cornerbacks, if not the very best, Surtain doesn't always cover the opponent's top wide receiver. For large chunks of his career, he stayed put at the left cornerback spot regardless of who was lined up out there, meaning teams could simply put their best wide receiver on the other side of the field. When opponents have been given the choice on whether to line their most targeted and proficient receivers against Surtain, who was chosen as the league's best cornerback in an ESPN survey of scouts, personnel executives and coaches in July, most play callers routinely chose against it, leaving Surtain to cover players who are rarely thrown the ball, wrote ESPN's Jeff Legwold on September 10. In Week 1, Surtain was matched up against Seattle Seahawks wide receiver DK Metcalf and held him to 3 receptions for 29 yards but was called for 2 penalties, although one of them was declined. Surtain was the number 9 overall pick in the 2021 NFL Draft after earning SEC Defensive Player of the Year honors and winning a CFP National Championship at Alabama in 2020, where he squared off against Pickens at Tennessee. After making 2 Pro Bowls and 1 NFL All-Pro in his first 3 seasons, Surtain cashed in on September 4 with a 4-year, $96 million contract extension with $77.5 million guaranteed, the largest contract for a defensive back in NFL history. In July, Bleacher Report's Christopher Knox named Surtain was one of just 15 true franchise players in the NFL. True franchise players are the most indispensable of the NFL's elite, Knox wrote. We're talking about Hall of Fame caliber stars who can lift their teams in the biggest games and change outcomes multiple times per season. We're talking about those who can be centerpieces for a decade or more. To qualify, players must be 28 or younger when the regular season begins on September 5 and must still be with the teams that drafted them. 7 overreactions from the Steelers' 13-6 win over the Denver Broncos. In the words of Chris Martin, it was all yellow. The Steelers' Week 2 victory over the Denver Broncos was an ugly game marred by 202 yards in total penalties and a painful second half to watch. The 13-6 final score reflects that. But a win is a win, and a 2-0 start is even better. This definitely isn't the first time this has been said about the Steelers, and I doubt it'll be the last. Pittsburgh was clearly the most talented team on the field on Sunday, but they couldn't get out of their own way. It shouldn't have been a stressful watch. Instead, Pittsburgh won by just 1 score. A lot of it comes down to penalties, 9 for 124 yards. There were some that were questionable calls, but this has been an issue for 2 straight weeks. The Steelers are the common denominator. Offensive coordinator Arthur Smith still looks like a good hire, but he's partly to blame as well. The play calling in the second half was less aggressive and more run-heavy, and both the air and ground game suffered as a result. The play-action game was working, why slow it down? The offense has issues with talent and execution, sure, but 3 second-half first downs just aren't acceptable. The good news is that the Steelers have looked far better than their last two opponents in terms of ability. The bad news is that the team has yet to play a full game like it. Ignoring the offensive woes for a bit, it's hard not to get excited about the Steelers' defense for another week. Pittsburgh has had a good to great defense for the past few years now, but 2024 looks like it could be something even more special if it can remain healthy. The Steelers currently have the NFL's second-best defense in terms of points allowed, and they're top 10 in yards allowed. T.J. Watt and company haven't had to blitz much to generate pressure. There are playmakers at every level, showcased by back-to-back multi-sack, multi-turnover games. Outside of a few unlucky breaks, the Steelers have smothered the last two offenses they've gone against, and from the second half of Week 1 to the first half of Week 2, Pittsburgh pitched a four-quarter shutout. Are there things to work on? Without a doubt. But this Steeler defense looks like it could be one to remember. It'll be hard for Russell Wilson to gain his starting job back if Justin Fields plays all game like he did in the first half against Denver. Of course, Fields didn't. But let's start with the positives. Fields had just 27 rushing yards against the Broncos, but his mobility adds an invaluable element to the Steeler offense, especially with its offensive line struggles. None made that point clearer than a 16-yard gain on a play that would have been a sack or incompletion with any other Steelers quarterback of the past several years. On top of that, Fields' short accuracy looked better. And his deep ball remains a strength. It didn't show on the stat sheet, but he had one long pass drop perfectly into Van Jefferson's hand, as the other was being held, as well as one of the best passes I've ever seen thrown downfield while on the move. Unfortunately, it was called back by a Broderick Jones penalty. Steelers could make Justin Fields-like trade for demoted Bryce Young in 2025. Everyone knows the Steelers got both Russell Wilson and Justin Fields this past offseason. One via free agency and the other via trade. They completely rebuilt their quarterback room on the team. Fields has been the starting quarterback for Pittsburgh during the first 2 weeks of the regular season, which saw 2 wins, but the offense continues to struggle to find points. Wilson will likely become the starter once his nagging calf injury heals. Unless Fields or Wilson can show enough to deserve a second contract with the Steelers, the team could be looking at a similar situation as last year. They might have to gut the quarterback room entirely and switch to other alternatives either via trade, in free agency, or the draft. Adam Schefter reported that the Carolina Panthers are benching Bryce Young as their starting quarterback. Andy Dalton will be taking over those duties for now. It's still early in the season, but it seems like Young might be done with the Panthers. It could be a similar situation that we saw with the Fields trade this past spring. Is Young as good as Fields? No. The consensus among most that watch the game of football is that Fields was a better player overall leaving the Bears than Young would be departing Carolina. If both Wilson and Fields cannot lock a future into place in Pittsburgh, then the Steelers should have some interest in Young. If he becomes available in a trade or cut scenario, it would be foolish to not do their due diligence. Young was one of the most highly sought-after prospects coming out of the 2023 NFL Draft. Both he and C.J. Stroud were being set up for significant futures as NFL quarterbacks. Stroud has been terrific, while Young has been dismal. Plenty of blame can be placed at Young's feet, but you cannot look past the consistent failures of the Panthers since they drafted him. They took a short quarterback when they selected Young, yet they refused to find protection for him up front. They couldn't keep a coaching structure around either. On top of all those things, Young has not been given many weapons during his time in Carolina. It is just a bad team overall and one that should have never given up as much as they did to trade up for Young. If Fields or Wilson show they can be the starting quarterback moving forward, then a trade for Young makes less sense. He could be a nice option to sit behind a veteran guy like Wilson and become the heir apparent when Wilson gets ready to retire. It might seem unlikely now, but this trade scenario could develop if Pittsburgh has a quarterback issue when the offseason comes. And you, fan? What do you think of the situation of Bruce Young? Leave your opinion in the comments.